Well, welcome tonight. I'm very pleased to be joined by UK column founder Brian Gerrish, regular and Eastern Approaches correspondent Alex Thomson, and Steve Pollard. Steve is from the Scottish People's Forum, a very active Facebook group, and is central in many things that are happening in Scotland to do with resisting the creeping tyranny that we're living under. The subject of tonight's discussion is how the interaction with the police officer went on the 6th of March when I went along to try and make a speech to a few like-minded souls on the green outside Holyrood. And up came a police liaison officer, and we've recorded the interaction, and we've got a transcript of it. So on the UK column website as interview with a Stormtrooper. So to start off, the first thing that happened was I was sitting there. I knew there was going to be trouble because as I walked in, I passed two van loads of cops, and they all watched me. Right? They clearly knew who I was, so I knew I was marked at that point. I went in, there was no one around. I was a little bit early. There was no setup. There was no of the people who'd invited me there. So I sat down in the sun, and over came these two police officers with blue vests on and police liaison written on them. And they knew my name. So they used my name, so they let me know that they knew who I was. And then they tried to initiate a conversation. So there was some initial nonsense about mask wearing, because I found it very difficult to hear what they were saying. So there was a bit of back and forth about that. But the first thing was they wanted to speak to me, and I didn't want to speak to them. So I said, I don't want to have a conversation with you. Right? And the response was to shout, "Why are you here?" in slowly and very loudly, as though I was stupid. I said, "I don't want to have a conversation with you." So he decided that he was just going to inform me. So my attempt at not having an interaction, the first of the four E's that they have is engaged. I didn't want to engage, and he insisted on engaging. So, to kick off things, what did you think about the insistence that there was going to be an interaction, even though all I was actually doing was sitting in the sun minding my own business at this point?
I think, David, the key to that is that the gentleman, and I think also the lady who is either a comrade of his rank or a superior who comes in later, both of them are blue-vested police. Now, people outside the United Kingdom might not be aware that there is this category of police. They're not a rank, but they have a particular designation, police liaison officer. And the blue vest indicates that they are there to have ginned up in advance of any public event, whether they expect disorder or not, but which they have been told to police, and to find out who the organisers and speakers are. And in fact, I might hand over to Brian at this point, because Brian Gerrish, having founded UK Column some years ago, has also called upon viewers to assemble peacefully on certain key occasions. The one I'm thinking of was Budget Day 2016, when we had an event on leafleting the public and making them aware of the sources of money outside the Houses of Parliament on that day in 2016 to coincide with the budget. And a lanky fellow of lowly police rank, but with a blue high visibility jacket like that, marched straight up to Brian, friendly and affable as though he was, and said, "Hello, Brian, I'll be your police liaison officer today," in much the same way as if you go to an American diner, you'll be told, "I'll be your server tonight." So I wonder whether you, Brian, have had any other interactions with these blue jackets, these police liaison officers, and whether you might like to substantiate my working hypothesis as it is a perfect cover for police intelligence gatherers and potentially even special branch, which is the police with access to classified knowledge and information who are also serving police officers.
Well, I think my reply to that would be that personally, I wouldn't have any doubt that they actually feed back into that sort of intelligence gathering system. To be fair, the ones I've encountered, and they were the ones up in London, but I've met them in other locations. The Birkenhead arrest of the judge, when there was 600 people on the streets, there was some of those people there as well. And they mixed very easily, and I'm going to say to their credit, they would actually talk, so you could have a discussion with them. But would I believe that, yeah, although they are sold as the soft end of the system, they're actually working with the harder intelligence guys behind them? I think that's an absolute given, and therefore you do have to be careful what you say to them. But I think they do have a role to play in that they do try and ease the tension and try and make whatever the event is a little bit more calm and measured. Maybe
that was the case back in what date was that when you met them?
2011 was Roger Hayes at Birkenhead, and 2016 was the Bradbury Pounds event in London. So we have a nice benchmark because that's exactly a decade ago and exactly half a decade ago.
Yeah, and probably even a year ago that was the case. But I didn't think when I met them there was an awful lot of softer side going on. They were determined they were going to deliver a message. And after the bit he finally got it, my advice was anyone assembling, in order to protest today in a group is in contravention of the current restrictions linked to the coronavirus under the Protection Coronavirus Scotland Act of 2020. Right. So that was the message he was insisting on giving me, and that was going to be delivered. Yeah. And he wasn't there to liaise, he wasn't there to diffuse, he was there to go through the process of the first stage of 4 stages, which ended up with my arrest. That was what I took him to be. From the outset, it was very kind of quite aggressive, certainly trying to dominate. Steve, you met someone on the same day. It wasn't a liaison officer. What was the sort of style and approach they used?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, you did a good job. I mean, I emailed you after I watched that, and I said it was very good to have that recording, because I had a very similar interaction with 2, what do you call them, normal police on the day. I've dealt with liaison officers before, and when they're liaising with you, Brian, you might be able to back this up. When they're liaising with you, when the event is going to go ahead, they can be quite friendly and amicable, you know. But if they've decided in advance that the event is going to be broken up, then I think that's what we saw on that day, David. You know, that's the other side of a liaison officer. You know, if they're going to let you go ahead, they'll introduce themselves. I'll be your as you say, Alex, I'll be your liaison officer for the day. I've had that twice, and they were actually very nice, laughing away, good. It's a great start to the day. But I could see on this day, David, this was not going to go ahead, because you wouldn't have enough numbers to force it to go ahead, and even then it's going to be grief all day. I had a similar interaction, again, about 15 minutes. You spent about 15 minutes, same kind of thing. Nice guys, no problem with the guys. A lot of the things they said to me, I didn't agree with. A lot of the things I said to them, they didn't agree with. This comment that they made, your guys made it, my guys made it, and I've heard it another couple of times, is we don't want to debate with you. Now, I'm a sales trainer. I train people to sell and to do good customer service. So I look at this from a customer service point of view. I've heard that a couple of times. We don't want to debate with you. Well, who does want to debate with us then? Because we need to debate with somebody. And that's the problem. They're just sent in to stop us. But that set piece, we're not going to debate with you. They've been trained to say that, to just stop the conversation right there, because they know they're going to get our argument, David. Yeah. And that's their way to get out of jail free card.
The initial gambit was, I thought, was somewhat out to entrap. So they asked me some questions, right? Said, what's your intention? Why are you here today? Now, you know, I don't have to answer that because I'm behaving lawfully. So I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't want to have a conversation with you. Later on, he came back and he said, where did you leave from today to come here? So that's to try and get a distance that I've travelled so he can slap me with a fine. So again, it was all quite, it was all aimed at getting something on me, which wasn't my idea of what a liaison officer should be doing. I'm thinking about someone who's trying to defuse the situation, get proper communication going, talk to someone reasonably on a level par, reasonably person to person, man to man. But that's not what I saw that day. So I complained a bit about that, about the threats of fines and things, and said this is threatening. They took exception to that. I then raised the issue of I was looking at this point for some sort of in to have a conversation, because this chap had marched up, he'd made his statement, he'd laid down the law, and I was thinking, okay, well let's have a conversation, and I was looking for a basis for a conversation. So I started off with, do you believe we're all equal in a common law jurisdiction? All right, because where I was going with that was going to be, so there shouldn't be any threats of fines or anything because we're all equal in a common law jurisdiction. I'm not doing that to you. You shouldn't be doing it to me. We should be interacting as equals. And then some discussion about what a common law jurisdiction, cause no loss or harm. Okay. Now he could have made the point that under that his view was that meeting in a group of more than two or something outside would represent harm under the coronavirus situation, and we could have discussed that, but he wasn't wanting to go in any of these places. They got very nervous when I raised the issue of a common law. What's your point? Where are you going with this? And what it was I was trying to get a basis for a discussion, and they were then starting to react like I was trying to trap them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he said he was intimidated, didn't he?
Well, later on he said he was intimidated by the camera, which is strange, because when I took the camera out, I said, I'm going to be recording this. I hope you don't feel intimidated, knowing fine well they all had cameras on me at the time. So I said to him, I hope you don't feel intimidated. It's just for record and my protection and yours. And he said at the time that he was quite okay with me taping it. But later on, as the argument didn't go really his way, he then decided to make an issue of or try to make an issue of the camera at one point. So it didn't go too well. Now, there was this other strange dynamic, which was almost like a dance routine. There was a choreography to it, because they would come up and they would say the piece, and then they would physically move away. And he would actually say, I'm now going to withdraw, and he'd physically walk away. And then there'd be a pause, and then they'd physically say, I'm now going to re-engage. So it was a bit like a really awkward dance. It was choreography. It was preset. It seemed to me to be someone who's told him to behave that way, because it wasn't a natural way to behave when you're interacting with someone. You don't do that.
I wonder, David, whether you actually ever saw the face of the male or liaison officer whom you dealt with, who in our transcript is called PS1, Police Scotland 1, because he was wearing his bog standard mask at the beginning of the interaction, no doubt just before you hit record on your camera. He was coming up to you and there were a few words that you just summarised to us. But he's already wearing his bog standard mask and approaching you by the time the recording starts. And then when he says he's not going to take his mask off despite your problems hearing him, and instead he's going to put on a mask with a higher degree of protection, a higher rate of protection, as he calls it, so that he can get within the dreaded 6-foot zone, or 2 meters, as they call it now. When he backs away from you as part of this choreography to change the mask, a couple of viewers have noticed, who would have more of a forte in body language than I do, that there would have been no reason for him to turn 90 degrees and bow his head in the way that he does in order to change his mask, other than if he didn't wish to be spotted or have his face recognized. And in combination with that, I'd make the point that, yes, you said a moment ago that he was making the argument that being recorded was intimidated, but it was me who did the transcript. And if my ears didn't fail me, I know that you were talking over each other at this point. I did hear the finishing off of that line. I am now going to withdraw because I find it intimidating that you, David Scott, are actually trying to negotiate with me about something ... In other words, that I don't wish to negotiate. And what you had said to prompt that would be, if you're not going to debate, I will tell you something.
Well, yeah, because he'd made his speech and he was trying to walk away without allowing me to respond, because he had spoken over me, which did annoy me a little bit, which probably wasn't the best response. Now, at this point, though, I did have a comeback line for that, and I had to bite my tongue because he said, I'm not going to negotiate with you. Right? The comeback line is, I don't negotiate with terrorists, because that's what came to mind, because we've just published in the UK column a story from Edinburgh from a few weeks previously, and the person there described the police behaviour as domestic terrorism, because they felt terrorised. But I managed to bite my tongue and not escalate things. But he was still then suggesting that he said that I'm trying to provoke a reaction. He said, I think so. You're trying to provoke a reaction, and this really surprised me, because I was on my own. There must have been 50 police officers roaming around there, all with batons, CS spray, tasers, and the idea that my purpose there was to provoke a reaction is imbecilic, right? So I was a bit shocked at that. I said, "Look, you've got weapons. Why would I want to provoke a reaction?" And at that point, the woman came in. Now, throughout this exchange, she was much more approachable, and there was more actual communication between me and the woman than between me and the male officer. So she came in, and I started to try and explain what my position was. Now, the position I was trying to get, and they really didn't want me to state my position. They didn't want to just be quiet for a moment and listen. So whenever I started to say anything, they would speak over the top of me. So you were never able to develop a position or state a case or state what the concern was. And what I was trying to get out was the state's position, the government position, isn't lawful. I mean, that was the core of my concern, but they didn't want to hear that. So we then had a wee bit of discussion, and then we get to one of the key aspects of this. They said, you can dispute the medical evidence and what have you as much as you like. Freedom of expression has not been suspended. I thought that was interesting, because it rather suggests it might be. So you could express yourself online. Mm-hmm. But they then went on to say that freedom to assemble and protest had been suspended, and went on to explain that it's a conditional right. It's not an absolute right; it's a conditional right, and it's been withdrawn by the government.
Of course, the language which comes from French legal parlance is a qualified right in the French sense of the word. Qualifié means to, as it were, put riders on something, to say, as long as the following conditions are met, or somewhat more circumscribed than absolute. And this is the training which I got as a young GCHQ officer in 2001 when I joined, just 3 years after the Human Rights Act had been passed, which itself was a gold plating exercise, a typical example of Whitehall ministries and members of Parliament at Westminster pretending to be transposing European legal ideas, in this case not EU but ECHR, a separate organisation, and a convention from 1950 that Britain was a founder signatory of, transposing that into British statute law and gold plating it, being the idea that we'll actually take this opportunity to put bells and whistles on what was supposed to be just an agreement of minimum standards. This gave the Blair government in 1998 a wonderful opportunity to say, well, hang any mention of common law, or even, if you're in the jurisdiction of Scotland, of previous statutory ideas of the boundaries of the right to assemble and to express yourself. All that matters now is that we have this new statutory cornerstone, a piece of statute legislation of constitutional significance, as the courts have meanwhile pronounced it, the Human Rights Act. It trumps everything, and according to that, the only absolute rights that can never be infringed by government in the name of the public with a capital P are the right to life and the right not to be tortured or subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment. All the others, including the right to family life, let alone the right to express and assemble, are qualified. That's the only training they've had. They've had it, in my opinion, far more vigorously than the rank or file Police Scotland or Metropolitan Police officer would have had. Perhaps that's by virtue of their special role, but they certainly have got quite a gymnastic mental training in that, to the exclusion of all other sources of law, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So, Steve, is this something you've come across in terms of the position that the police officers are taking? Have you seen any sort of evolution of this during the various interactions you've had with them?
The qualified right thing comes up a bit. They're not entering into a debate. The science, the fact that the protests are, they're concerned that there's health concerns over the gatherings. It's sound bites that are coming up again and again and again. It is exactly the same spiel. They say the same things. I've had 3 or 4 interactions. All of them have been good, no arrests, nothing like that, but the same kind of things come up all the time.
Okay. So the next area I went into was the relationship with the public, because I'd taken the view that for me to sit in the sunshine and not bother anyone and be behaving utterly lawfully, these people came up and then immediately start threatening me with fines, fixed penalty charges, is a threat, because that's I'm going to take money. If I went up to someone sitting in a park and said, I want you to do this or refrain from doing that lawful act, otherwise I'm going to take money off of you, that would be threatening behaviour, because we're all equal in common law jurisdiction. I objected to being treated like that. So I referred to it a few times as threatening, which obviously they didn't see it that way. But I then brought up, what's the relationship between the public and the police? And that was a short but quite an interesting exchange. So I said, you police by consent, do you believe that? And it was right away, yes, we police by consent. So there was no resistance there. I'm not sure what it means anymore, but maybe Alex and Brian, you might comment on this, but they were clear that they did. And I then said, do you believe your citizens in uniform? And there was some reference that, well, it'd be naive to think so. And then I returned, do we believe we're all equal in common law jurisdiction? And it was then, we then got this other line, which is, people have a different view from you, sir. Everyone's got to be able to express their view, which was... and
you were told you needed to respect that. You got quite a nannying comeback, didn't you, from the woman police officer at this point?
Yes. And my point was, I'm quite happy with anyone having a contra view. I'm not trying to fine anybody. So that little exchange about what the role of the police was, what did you think of the reaction there?
Well, we have had UK column viewers send us correspondence with the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice at UK level, not so much with the devolved Scottish institutions, asking what they understand to be policing by consent. And the answer that comes back from Whitehall is, absolutely, we pay lip service to the founding principles of policing in the modern sense with which Sir Robert Peel equipped the Metropolitan Police. The idea that they have to police by consent being that they are accepted by the public as being morally upstanding and lawful enough to do the job of all of us on a full-time professional paid basis. But the correspondence is quick to add in recent years that this doesn't mean that individuals can withdraw their consent to be policed, which leads us down a bit of a blind alley, because I think some of the authorities are keen to paint us all as free man on the land version 1.0, with no finesse to our understanding of how common law and statutes relate to each other. Possibly Brian would like to come in there, because he has had quite a lot of people talking to him about the police and their evolving understanding for quite some years now.
Well, I got two things here. Well, just to answer what you were talking about straight away, what jumped into my mind was Rice versus Connolly, 1966, which is the test case, the all-important test case, saying that people do not have to assist the police in their work. And that really must say it all, because there is no doubt as to whether we can choose to assist the police or not. We do have that consent, and that's proved in that Rice versus Connolly case law. So that's the first thing that came into my head. The second one is that by strange coincidence, today I was given a document, which is what I keep looking at because I called it up on the screen. It's called the Office of Constable, the bedrock of modern day British policing. And this is by the Police Federation. The one that caught my eye was this particular page, the Office of Constable, the strengths of the Office of Constable. It says police officers must be allowed to police with discretion. Discretion is the bedrock of policing. It allows reasoned and fair decisions based on experience to be taken by police officers without the need to take a course of action merely to satisfy targets. Police officers cannot legally be instructed to arrest a person. It's a decision they must take for themselves using their experience, knowledge and discretion to take the most appropriate course of action to fulfill their function as officers of the Crown. And this document also talks about policing by consent. But I thought that statement there, which of course I would say we knew, but it's interesting to see it being echoed back to the police, that any one of those police around you, David, and certainly one who's sort of threatening to take money off you, the piece that I've just read says to me, well, actually, what he's doing, he's got to be solely accountable for himself. He cannot blame somebody else and say, I was told to do it. I know you're in Scotland, and in principle, this would be from the Police Federation south of the border, but I suspect there's still large overlapping areas.
Just as a codicil to that, yes, indeed, people can easily find in the Dundee Student Law Review, if they search for the phrase Scots Criminal Law and the Right of Silence, a 14-page article by Robert Shiels, which points out that although a 2016 piece of Scottish devolved legislation tried to codify and tidy up previous entitlements and immunities under Scots law in this regard, the position is substantially the same as the England and Wales 1966 judgment of Rice versus Connolly, that even after arrest, you don't have a positive obligation to do more than confirm your identity.
Yeah, and I'll just add this bit. This is from the same page on the strengths of the officer constable. It says, police officers must be apolitical, impartial and accountable for their actions. If not, how and what we police will become if not, how and what we police will become subject to political whim and electioneering. The operational independence of our police service comes with the office of constable. So everything I'm reading on this guidance here for the police is pointing back continually that when the police man or woman operates as a police constable, each and every decision they make is their individual decision, and they can't say we were told or the policy is. They've got to judge it themselves on the ground.
Yes, and it was explicitly that we're here because the chief constable told us this is the policy.
Well, I remember that, David, and of course this is where it gets extremely interesting, because what are we now seeing? That the chief constables are assuming power that they don't actually have, and are attempting to coerce police constables into breaking the law.
Just as a wrap up on that as well, it's again an English legal practice, but a Welshman was recently arrested by the police in dubious circumstances, somewhat akin to what happened to David, and the case became Neale, N-E-A-L-E, versus the Director of Public Prosecutions, Neale versus DPP, a write-up of that by bindmans.com. The practice that represented Mr. Neale points out just how many ways the police fell short there. This would apply in Scotland too.
So after this sort of interaction about what the relationship is between the police and the public, and that terminated with, well, we're just here to do what the chief constable tells us to do, which is a point that you might want to comment on. There was then the first description of the qualified rights. My colleague explained very clearly that if you're to gather here to assemble, that's a qualified right that's covered by the legislation. So I questioned this. And then this is, well, it's a public health issue. And I tried to argue back and push back at that from a point of view that the statistics don't back that up. And the policewoman who was always more, she was the more human of the two throughout the interaction. I'm trying to make a point, right? So I make the point that she's not interacting with me as one human being to another. There's no normal human interaction. There's no normal discussion, and that's not normal. We should be able to interact as human beings. And she's mollified to that to some extent by that, to at least allow me to speak for a little bit. But then she says, well, carry on, but you're trying to get me to agree with you. With your opinion, which I cannot do. I cannot commit to that. So this is this first strange thing that she's saying that for her to allow me to speak is somehow somehow her agreeing with my position, that she has to silence my position or agree with it. There's no third road. There's no point she can just listen to me and not agree. That doesn't seem to occur to her. And I then said, well, she said, I can't commit to agreeing with you. I said, well, of course you can't. If you agree with me, they'll sack you. It'll be your job. And at that point, I see in her eyes recognition that what I took from that moment was, her reaction was, he's right. So firstly, did you see it watching the video? Did you see that reaction in her?
Well, I certainly did, yeah, because it was very noticeable that she reacted to that, and my feeling on it at the time was that she actually hit home. Oh, sorry, what you'd said hit home, and she knew that what you were saying was correct. So I don't know whether this is appropriate place for me to say that actually I think that we can look at the position of the police here, and perhaps we have to understand a bit that actually you might have been a lot more formidable than you would have thought. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you're there as a well-dressed gentleman in your tweeds, you're putting across a very reasoned argument, and those police are having to deal probably with somebody that they don't usually deal with. You are not somebody who's been out and had a skinful of lager on a Friday night and are heading towards the fun of a punch-up. They're well trained for those sorts of things. So you represent a body of the public that they don't normally have to interact with. And probably I can add at this stage as well, to interact with in a scenario where they're not entirely comfortable with their own ground themselves. So when you put across an intellectual argument to them, you're actually putting them under a lot more pressure than you might think.
Yes, Brian, you have said to UK column viewers in the past, haven't you, that the police are trained to deal violently with people if they feel they have to or have a pretext to, but not to deal with people who are peaceful and polite and lawful. And it is a departure, I think, from historic policing in Britain and the whole of the Commonwealth and the English-speaking world that, as David has just pointed out, both the woman and the man representing the police on this occasion emphatically said that they could not agree with David on certain things, man to man or person to person. And historically, until very recently, and still very much so if you look at the United States, or even some of the fascist-tending Commonwealth dominions like Australia and Canada, you will see that policemen have that general English-speaking worldwide attitude of, yes, we're all in the same boat, or I am of the people too. That natural interaction has suddenly and rapidly disappeared from, it would seem, at least Police Scotland now. And I know, living over in the Netherlands here for over a decade, that even the softest version that the Dutch have here of civil law policing involves the policeman saying, I'm here to enforce the law, not to have a chinwag with you. I am not of the same species as you, effectively, because of the cap I wear. So that is, a step change. The other thing that goes with the collapse of confidence is that the woman, but also the man, which is even more surprising, I suppose, because he didn't seem camp or effete in other ways, the male policeman interacting with David, or engaging, as they now say, spoke with his hands a lot, such that one of the first viewers to leave a comment on David's upload of the video suggested that because it was so reminiscent of a children's TV character, that the video should be entitled "Mr. Tumble Joins the Stasi." So instead of the old confidence of I am of the people, in the United States, they would give that a particular twist. They would say, absolutely, I'm a police officer, but I'm an American too. I feel just the same as you. That's gone to be replaced with, I must enforce things. The chief constable's given me certain orders. It reminds me of the response in London to the 2005, the summer 2005 events, 7/7 and then 21/7, Jean-Charles de Menezes. And everything since then, the chief constable has spoken. It may also be that David was personally recognized from a mugshot because, of course, these liaison officers might have come pumped and a little fearful and apprehensive out of a meeting. After all, a briefing, I mean, because they did, after all, suggest that David was assembling, although he was sitting, I think, on his Todd on a park bench. So he, if anything, he was communing with the Holy Ghost or with nature, but perhaps not assembling in the formal sense of the word. And yet, that was the line they'd taken. He was a figurehead for something bigger than himself.
Yes, and we can add to that it is clear that the police are extremely worried about publicity. So your camera, David, will have affected that. Both of those two, that they knew that they were recording. They do this all the time, of course, with their body cameras, but the recording of them by the public has an effect on them. So everything they did, everything they said, they knew was being recorded. And that's why I think, actually, particularly the lady said she couldn't agree with you, because anything she'd agreed with, would have been on camera. And I think that could have been used against her, probably would have been used against her, which is why you got reaction.
I wasn't kidding when I said it would be her job if she'd agreed with me. I do believe that. I think she'd be toast. Yeah.
You took it through and you told her that, and that, of course, was the icing on the cake.
And there was, what I saw in her eyes was recognition and a little bit of fear.
Yes. Of
the position that she was in. But certainly I thought of, oh no, he's right moment. And she almost froze. And the male cop at that point came in and he started to sort of argue, well, you talk about medical science, we're not qualified, we're just here to, do what we're told. And my response to that was, well, you can count. And the issue here, and the point I was trying to make, and I kept trying to make, and I never actually got the argument stated because they kept talking over the top of me, is that even under the government's own interpretation of what's lawful and how they can remove our rights, even if you accept that, the limitations in their own rules for what they can do state that they must remove the rights only to the most minimal degree that's proportionate to the nature of the emergency.
Well, that is guidance, isn't it? But trumping guidance and somewhere almost on a par with law in their minds is police policy. Now, in some jurisdictions, San Antonio, Texas springs to mind, where I've seen a very well-watched video on this issue. Police are honest enough, at least the sergeant, who's the senior officer responding to something, will say police policy dictates certain things which are not in the law. right? But you don't get that honesty, but you do get here in your exchange with Police Scotland effectively a de facto admission that policy trumps that guidance, David, because the Chief Constable, a kind of totalitarian personification of what the law is, the Chief Constable has told us not to allow this to happen. So
exactly.
That evidently in practice trumps.
The point I was trying to make was if the state passes legislation that's clearly disproportionate to the cause, such as in response to a virus with a normal all-cause mortality rate, closes down the entire economy, locks everyone in their homes, rescinds free speech, free assembly, the right to protest, the right to travel, the right to go to a funeral, all of this, it's clearly disproportionate, ergo unlawful, which is obviously something they were determined that they wouldn't listen to me saying, because they kept, whenever I went in that direction, they would talk over the top of me.
They wouldn't just do that, David. They would telegraph, kind of like stage whispers or stage directions, prompting what they were going to do with their bodies next. And we've already noticed body language and flailing arms and so on. But in this relatively short transcript of a 13 or 14-minute interaction, I count 4 mentions of "I'm going to withdraw." Now, the first of them is simply letting you know that the chap is going to move back a bit and put another mask on. That's not quite sort of "I'm going to withdraw" in the sense of disengage. But the 3 others, and I think with this amount of repetition, maybe it's an indication that that's in the training, engage and withdraw, is that when you say, "I wish to tell you something," the male police officer says, "No, I'm going to withdraw because I find it intimidating that you're trying to negotiate with me." Again, you, David, say, "I'm not going to answer your question," which draws again from the male policeman the response, "I'm going to withdraw now. I've given you information about coronavirus. I've talked to you." And finally, the woman police officer also, in response to you saying no statistics, just as you were mentioning, David, she responds, "Right, so we're going to withdraw. You obviously don't want to talk to us." I wonder, Steve, whether you have ever come across in your entanglements with Police Scotland this usually notoriously robust force saying such a apparently mardy thing as "I'm going to run away now."
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, Brian's point earlier is spot on. They don't come across people like David every day of the week. He's a well-dressed, intelligent man who's standing in his truths, and he's putting his points across and defending his position well. I think that's the challenge that they had, that they're withdrawing because they don't know how to deal with it. We're going to withdraw. We don't know what to say here.
I read it slightly differently, Steve. I thought it was training. Because
it
had a rehearsed air to it. It had like a choreographed. It was almost like a dance. We're going to come in.
Absolutely, and chipping in with the intonation that I listen to very carefully as a transcriber and always have done since my GCHQ days. The intonation when it's "right, we're going to withdraw" is very much training kicks in. Next line of script. If not response as expected, then
chance
withdraw.
To think. Yeah, and the other point Brian made, I feel, is very, very relevant. Would a person in a tracksuit be treated the same way as David? Would we get the same respect? Is there a discrimination there, a positive discrimination, David? Did you get a good run with them that someone else might not have got? I mean, everyone under common law, under the law of the land, should get the same treatment. But I think you handled it well and got treated relatively well. I had a similar experience the same day. No arrests. You got a chance to talk, but we didn't achieve the end result of talking them into letting us protest that day.
Surely, Steve, you're not possibly suggesting that if David had been a Ned from Pilton, he might have got a response more like "You need to watch yourself there, Sonny."
That's pretty much, if you read between the lines, exactly what I'm saying. He would have been in the back of the van, and that's really unfair. That's the horrible thing. On the approach to the field that David and I were in, or where David videoed from, on the approach to that, I saw a guy being dragged away with 6 cops, and he shouted over to me. I don't know what I was meant to do to help him. I couldn't. But he shouted over to me, and I could see, but I don't know what the interaction was before that. But he was being manhandled into a van. I don't know what he said, but I'm assuming he didn't say some of the things or approach it in the way David did. So when I saw this, I emailed David and I said, this is valuable to look at. They have their training. You know, we want to know what kind of things they say. We'd love to get these protests off the ground. I don't think anything we could have said that day, David, and you can agree or disagree with me. If we had 20, 30, 50 of us saying the same things, I don't think we'd have got the protest off the ground that day. The decision had been made, we were going to be dispersed.
The decision had been made, we're going to be dispersed, and if it required violence to do it, they were ready for that. There was nothing we could have said. You're quite right. The next bit in the exchange gets to a really key part, and when you're talking about training, Steve, this is one of the things I want to get everyone's comment on, because it gets to one of the key points that they're making using the law, or the law as they see it. Right. So the exchange goes that I was told, this policewoman said, I can state my opinion. That's your human right to state your opinion. Right. To which I said, yeah, of course. However, she says, you're not allowed to state your view in this forum today. I asked why. She said, because freedom of assembly is a qualified right. And at this point, and I should have probably done more of this, I asked her to explain. Right? And this is much more powerful than I thought it was going to be. Explain to me what that means. So she said, it means that legislation can be put in place to restrict that right. My follow-up question was, is there any limit on that legislation? Can the government do anything it wants? And she said, with a sort of tone of her, yes, obviously, within the parameters of what it decides. So the only thing that's restricting the government is what it itself decides. So I said, so you're telling me today that the government's power is absolute? And then she said, no, you're putting words in my mouth. And actually, I don't think I was. I was trying to fairly state back to her what she said. I said, that's what you said, the government can do anything. And so at that point, she's backing off, and she at this point, she's very awkward and very much wants the exchange to stop. But can I have your comments, gentlemen, on this point of the qualified right and the power of the state? I mean, how do you see the law? What actually is the law? And what do you think of the fact that the police are being briefed in this way?
Whichever side of the border you are, we have given the Crown sovereignty, which in an earlier stage of our constitutional scholarship, we understood perfectly well was limited. Scots law was even more emphatic about this than English law was, but it was widely understood. This was then covered up by the theory that Parliament was absolutely sovereign, which has trickled down to that woman police officer saying legislation can curtail your rights, which is a twisted version, but the one that's come down to her, because of course actually the Crown could do that through an order in council, through an executive decree through the Privy Council, and it's only convention that the legislature would be involved, because the legislature of course is us talking to the executive. It's where the Crown meets the people. It's not the state. Legislation and Parliament are not the state, it's us. But this is even before the Human Rights Act came in. The de facto reality was that the Crown could do certain things to us, but it had bound itself by a coronation oath not to do certain things because we had God-given unalienable rights. And other things which it could do, falling short of that category, it would do only after consulting us as to our will in Parliament. So a very inaccurate version of the law has come down.
I mean, this is one of the things I missed at the time. I didn't get into it because it was at this point it was getting quite heated. But this is critical, because she was saying that the rights can be the qualified rights that can be suspended by Parliament. And what I didn't
all of them can be, except the right to life and the right to not to be tortured. All the others can be curtailed by the state, according to the ECHR.
But of course, the response to that as well, but I've got God-given inalienable rights that predate the qualified rights you're talking about, and that my God-given inalienable rights have never been rescinded or removed, so they're still present. And that would include the right to assemble peacefully and the right to talk to another human being if I so choose.
I think the response would have been, "That's your opinion, sir." And if you pushed it, you might have got the sort of nannying that you got from that woman anyway, which was, you need to respect other people's opinions, which is British code for foreign viewers for shut up. You know, and if you look at the 4 E's that you put in your article at the bottom of the transcript, that which the police have been told to do in these situations: engage, educate, encourage, and enforce. Explain is not one of those E's, and you rather cheekily and accurately suggest that escalate and entrap are the real 5th and 6th E's. But if you search the transcript for explain, David, because you were just saying a moment ago, I wish I had elicited more explanation from them and said, please explain what you mean by that. There are no fewer than 6 mentions of explain in this transcript, right? My colleague has explained what the steps are very clearly. I've explained why we came over to talk to you. Please explain to me what that means. So that one is you talking to the police, David. You're trying to put words in my mouth. I'm trying to explain it in simple terms. David replies, if you let me speak, I'll explain my point. Police repeating himself, I'm going to explain that legislation to you. So actually, this has struck me for the first time, for all that I was the transcriber. In amongst the 4 mentions of explained by the police to you, David, one of them includes the enforcement and part of the executive of the government, all which was given power by us, of course. The enforcement arm of the executive, namely the police, is saying we are here to explain legislation to you. That's ultra vires, isn't it?
Well, haven't we got an interesting example of the police believing that this is the case with Cressida Dick, who's just said that it was only the police on the spot could judge whether the law had been broken.
Yes, indeed.
I'm put in mind also of Peter Hitchens, who I think is a similar standing to David Scott, in the sense that quite a lot of police above constable level, maybe sergeants and inspectors who are managing policing, would think, oh, it's one of those ringleaders. Right, so Peter Hitchens was the first, chronologically, that I'm aware of in Britain to have reported in a blog from about 2018 that when he went up to a roadblock and thought he would have an old-fashioned chinwag with the police and say, do you mind if I saunter through because I'm clearly just a pedestrian, that they drew their truncheons out and yelled at him, it's not negotiable, it's not negotiable. So that's all of a piece. And so it predates COVID. It's something that came in around the time of, I don't know what it is, around the time of just after Brexit and various other woke causes coming up in society at that time that were making police very difficult, particularly in London.
Now, so at this point, with the admission that the police are viewing the state as absolute, I'm now starting to enjoy myself at this point, and the police are wanting away. So that's why I'm starting to speak much more slowly and softly, which is interesting as I look back on my own performance. So that's an example of confidence, right? Shouting is when you're not confident. Slowly and softly is when you're confident. So I'm speaking more slowly and softly. So look, if you let me speak, I'll explain my point. So the response is a shrill response from the woman. That if you do such and such, you may be liable to arrest. So, so it's the first time they've mentioned arrest, right? And bear in mind, I'm sitting on my own on a stone wall in a park, not doing anything. So
you're assembling, David. You're assembling
on my own, though. Yeah. So I take exception to this. I say, well, you see, you've escalated it now. You're now threatening to abduct me. Right, and that word triggered both of them because they both said in unison. We didn't say abduct. I said, yeah, abduction, wrongful arrest is abduction. See how you've escalated it. So one of my complaints, if you like, about the way they handled this is they were constantly escalating. They had to go through the 4Es and they wanted to escalate it through the 4Es, where they proper policing role is to de-escalate problems, and that I think came across. So at that point, they're getting quite shrill, and then they depart. Right. So my colleagues are going to speak to you now, and I know what's coming because the next thing is I get lifted and I decide I need to be out of there. So just before I go to the very last bit of the exchange. On this abduction and the response to that and the threat of arrest, what did you make of all of that?
There was a word they didn't like straight away. I didn't see it that they just didn't like the word. I don't think they think arrest is in any way an abduction in the way you meant it. And I think the word triggered them both at the same time. What do you guys think on that?
That's it, because semantically, thinking of it from linguistic analysis, abduct is what bad people do, right? And the fiction they're trying to maintain is that to arrest, it's a neutral or beneficial thing for the public with a capital P, that nebulous thing out there that they police on behalf of. And so the idea was, arresting is a neutral or beneficial activity, I think, that they're trying to preserve. And if you identify that with abduct, which is something that bad mafias do, they can't compute with that. And one of the ways in which the word arrest is further softened or hollowed out so that police can use it without any troubles of conscience when they know that they're lifting a peaceful person is that they turn it from a verb into a noun. We effected an arrest. Likewise, to engage with someone is a euphemism for we discourage them from being there. But, we effected an arrest. And recently we find the idea of de-arresting. We made undone what we did. There is now no offence and no possibility of being sued because we said, well, we shouldn't have arrested you, so we've de-arrested you. I saw it in that kind of category. Perhaps Brian thinks something different or similar?
Oh, no, I think it was, again, it was a very interesting thing to watch. The word disturbed them. But of course, what are these people that in general, we're going to be nice to them, we'll say. In general, they are people who think they are there doing a good job. And in many ways, they do have a hard job. They do get a lot of angst from as they go about their average policing. And so, I'm going to say that maybe, David, your words stung them in particular, because I can't use the phrase with you, but if you were south of the border, I would say you had Middle England saying to the police, "You're up to no good." What are you? Your Scottish gentry saying to the police.
But this is exactly, that's why I chose the word, to make that point. The legislation they're trying to enforce is unlawful. Therefore, actions that they do on peaceful people are unlawful. Therefore, it's not arrest; it's abduction. That was the reasoning underpinning the line I took. Yes.
Abduct and kidnap are words that you'll see in a lot of videos that do their rounds in YouTube and things, where people are quoting the common law position, and they'll say, "I'm being abducted" or "I'm being kidnapped," because they're not recognising that it's a lawful arrest. And that's why the word resonated the way it did with them. Would you use the same word again, David?
Absolutely. I thought it was spot on. And the fact that it got a reaction like that was very interesting. So at this point, what I was expecting was, it was now clear that if I hung around, there was no one to talk to. There was no one else assembled there. There was no event happening. It was quite clear the police were going to allow no event. So I figured at this point, if I hung around much longer, I was going to be lifted, or at the very least fined. And I didn't want anything to do with any of this. So when the policewoman said, "My colleagues are now going to speak to you," so that was the next escalation, right? So there was another bunch of colleagues now that they were only going to either fine me or arrest me. There wasn't anything else going to happen there. So I said, "No, I don't want anything more to do with this. I'm off." The policewoman said thank you. Now that was quite interesting. She thanked me for leaving. So she thought what she was there to do was to make me go away, so I didn't assemble and breach the coronavirus regulations.
Yeah, that's exactly what she thought.
Yeah. The other police officers, who I never saw because I never looked in their direction, did a really strange thing. They said a very bizarre thing, and it struck me later on how weird it was, because they didn't say, "We're detaining you." They didn't say, "You're under arrest." They said, "You're going to stay with us now, okay?"
Yeah, that's what they said, yeah.
Right? Now,
it's all a bit Jedi, isn't it?
That's Jedi mind trick. These are not the droids you're looking for. We're going to tell you what you're going to think. No, you're not. You're not a Jedi. So that was an attempt to get me to stay there so they could interact with me further, which would result in a fine or...
That's how close it was to arrest.
Yes.
That's how close it was to... When they said that was... And you made the decision, you said, no, I'm off. I'm not having this, I'm off.
And someone who saw this video and had been in some of the demos in Edinburgh said I was one beard hair away from getting arrested. So I don't think it was maybe quite as close to that, but it was there or thereabouts. And a lot of the interactions I've seen where people end up getting fined or arrested, they get fined or arrested because they hang around and let the police escalate the situation. The police are not trying to de-escalate, they're trying to escalate. And the members of the public who are there was one chap I saw in England who was giving soup to homeless people. He was arrested for that under coronavirus regulations, which is horrendous. But he stood around for about 15, 20 minutes while the police escalated this process. And at any point, he could just have turned around and walked off. And they couldn't have done anything to stop him because he hadn't done anything that was arrestable. But he let them work the situation up to a point where they could arrest him.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to be going and making that mistake, so I left. The sort of final sort of funny bit was I was followed for a wee bit, but they didn't follow me very long. But they then sent a car because obviously, you know, they'd obviously had their 1 hour's beneficial exercise for the day, so they didn't want to walk after me. So they sent an unmarked car, but with 2 uniformed officers, to follow me and a chap who turned up for the speech and who was having a chat with me as we walked off. So they followed me up to Carlton Hill in this unmarked car, but the police officers in the car were uniformed and they waved at me at one point. They gave me a little wave and a smile. So that was my tale for a little while, and then that just decided to go away, and that was the end. Sort of final reflections on it. I thought that they were trying to escalate and entrap. I thought it wasn't a patient approach. It was, we have got a script. We have got a choreography. We're going to go through the script. We're going to follow the choreography, and you either comply or you're in the cells. Essentially, was the line that they had, I thought, drummed into them, and it did clearly disturb them when I was trying to argue that there was a lawful, rational, reasonable position that had them as the bad guys. I think they found that a bit disturbing. In terms of how I did in the interaction, I suppose to finish up, gentlemen, things to do better, mistakes I made there, things that I didn't do as well as I could have. Could you suggest a few?
Was that your first interaction ever?
With the cops?
Yep.
Apart from traffic stops, yeah.
So that's your first major interaction with them?
Yeah.
It was very good.
I'd give you a 9 out of 10 too, but I would say possibly a little quieter tone of voice if this ever happens again, because particularly in Scotland, if the constable's got through all his objective ways to arrest you, he can always fall back, and this is by deliberate design in recent statutes around the English-speaking world. He can always fall back on a completely subjective one. I was concerned that there was going to be a breach of the peace or some other public order problem. So any time that you sound emotional, some of the constables are thinking, oh yes, what section of what law again is completely without reasonable observer test?
Yeah. The way they engaged you, though, David, was quite condescending, and it wasn't very pleasant start to the conversation. So it was very easy to get up, highly emotional about it straight away. It wasn't a good start by them, not by you.
Yeah. It certainly escalated from the get-go. Yeah, I agree with the comment about I could have been calmer. I thought as I got more into it, I got calmer. And that was as I was more used to the interaction. It was maybe a bit of inexperience.
It could be the training, though. They might bring out the worst in us. The approach, the approach is. I mean, the approach will be well thought through to create a reaction. No doubts.
Well, and I think the other key thing is that their training is that they are always dealing with dangerous people. Everything in their briefing is that they are going out and they're facing dangerous people, because this is one of the ways by which the police are themselves being controlled, because the police have been made fearful of the general public. And so, you know, they go out expecting it to escalate, because they've been told the people they're going out to police are dangerous, wacky extremists, you know, all the labels.
They're also fearful of COVID and unmasked individuals. I in my interaction, one of the cops said to me, imagine that you had COVID just now and you gave it to a 72-year-old woman and she died. And I said, well, that's not likely to happen. That's what, and he wasn't kidding on. He wasn't pulling my leg. He was genuinely very, very serious. He thought he could say that to me, and I was going to say, "You're right. I've changed my mind. I shouldn't be here." What was I thinking? You know, he genuinely thought that was a danger. So that they're worried about the danger of COVID as well, of course, because that's the way they've been trained, or they wouldn't be policing in that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
How much do they believe it? Some certainly do. I don't know if they all do. There seems to be a certain loss of rationality with the whole COVID thing across the society. But this, I imagine just one victim, if you save just one life. This argument at the margin, as though it's everything, ignoring the big picture. Give up all your rights.
Save one life.
Because it might save one life. Right? And of course, the response to that as well, it could cost one life. Right? You know, people are committing suicide because they don't have enough contact with other human beings. Right? If giving up all of our rights costs one life, are we happy with that?
Yeah.
And that kind of overcomes that line of argumentation.
What do you feel you learned most from the interaction, David?
Stay calm, ask questions, smile, look happy. Really annoys them. And always remember that we're all equal in a common law jurisdiction. And if they're claiming the right to do anything to me that I can't do to them, that's a sign that they're doing something unlawful. Question it.